Okay, so we're going to cover about half of this access and security lecture today. The first half is basically some principles of security, and the back half will be how it's specifically been applied to Facebook over the years. Okay. So, start off with introducing security passwords, authentication, encryption models. Then the second half, we'll talk about different types of attacks. So some of them you've surely heard of, like phishing and distributed denial of service attacks. And we'll have some more. And then we'll talk about some notable attacks and vulnerabilities that Facebook has experienced, just to give something concrete to go to these. And then last, talk about who attackers are, why they do it, and what you can do to try to stop them. Okay. So, security and access are two very closely related concepts, and roughly speaking, two sides of the same coin, right? So, you want to make sure that the good guys can access their stuff and the bad guys cannot access stuff that isn't theirs. So, security basically means preventing outsiders from somehow peeking in or messing with the system. For example, you don't want them to view your data. You don't want them to see your emails or other stuff. You don't want them to tamper with your data, right? You don't want them to, basically throw a grenade into your database. And you don't want them to block your access to your data, right? As in the example of a distributed denial of service attack. Access, on the other hand, is basically around ensuring that you can view your own data and that you can update or otherwise change your own data. Okay, so the good guys can do what they're supposed to. That's access. Security is keeping the bad guys out. And both of those are permission-based. They work through the same thing. Essentially, if you have the keys to the lock, you can do stuff. If you don't have the keys, you can't. Okay. So basic categories of security threats. There's physical, right? The actual physical devices, hardware, buildings that things are stored in, that sort of thing. People, right? The people that are entrusted with making sure that the system's running the way it's supposed to. And then software, right? All these computerized rules that are supposed to ensure system security. Now, any of those can be the point of vulnerability, right? For example, physical attack, right? There's some data. I want to get the data. I get a bunch of my buddies. We get some guns. We kick in the office door. We run in. We grab the hard drives. We run out. Okay? That's a physical attack. There's no clever software, hacking or anything else involved. We just blow open the doors and steal the stuff. Personnel. All right, well, suppose, fine, the organization comes along, they put a big door, that we can't just kick in. Well, maybe I happen to know that the night shift guard is only making $10 an hour, and he's got a bit of a gambling problem and a bit of a coke problem, and, for the right consideration, he could accidentally leave that door unlocked for me, right? That's a personnel issue. Guy's supposed to be there watching the door, making sure it's locked, but, yeah. And then software, okay? Of course, I could just, probably the most difficult, I could somehow try to hack their system and access data that I'm not supposed to. All right. Any of those can be point of vulnerability, and attacks can span multiple categories. For example, you guys remember the Target hack? Even if you don't remember the Target hack of 2013, you know this. Let me find my Target card. Now, there's a little chip on everybody's card, right? Chips existed before that, but that was what really brought it home to people. And then there was a Home Depot attack right after, same kind of thing. Essentially, they lifted people's numbers, their credit card numbers, and were able to reuse them. And the idea was, well, if you put a chip on their card, then you have to ensure that the card is actually physically there, and you're not just some guy who has the numbers for that card. Okay, so that one was a combination of physical. They put some bad stuff on the devices to lift the numbers, and then they reused them. They got, they got access to data that they shouldn't have. Anyway, but this is IDS 200, so we're going to mostly focus on software. We're going to acknowledge the first two, that physical and personnel security are important, but we're mostly interested in software because it's IDS 200. Now, one thing to start with, perfect security is impossible. It is literally not possible to devise a perfectly secure system. The reason is this. Any system that can actually be used must have some means of access, right? The keys exist. Well, if the keys exist, the bad guys can potentially somehow get their hands on them, right? They could guess what the key is. They could make a copy of the key. They could see somebody using it and say, oh, that's what the key is. They could steal the keys. They could co-opt them. They could somehow use them for in an inappropriate, poorly understood way that, oh, shit, we shouldn't have been able to let that happen, but they did, right? Like the case of the Bitcoin hack. They thought their system was, going to stop the guys from doing what they did, but they had so many requests so fast, they got under the gate. Okay, so if the keys exist, the bad guys could possibly somehow get the keys. Therefore, perfect security is not actually possible. So, examples. Password hacking, right? You see this all the time in TV shows, right? Anybody ever see that movie Watchmen from about 10 years ago? Yeah? They guess the password at the end, right? Yeah. It's hard to do, but it can happen. What you always see on the TV shows is they try to say, oh, what's his wife's birthday? And then they'll type that in as the 4-digit PIN code. Yeah, shit like that. It sometimes works, right? Or they'll do dumb stuff like 1, 2, 3, 4. Or there's been any number of cases. There was that Experian hack like a few years ago, one of their South American operations. Basically, they had as a password admin. And so the bad guys got in, oh, let's just see if admin works on this. And yeah, it did, and they got in and got stuff. Password document theft. So these days, everybody has a whole bunch of different passwords, right? Literally dozens of passwords to different sites, different accounts, whatever. You have to keep them somewhere, right? Most people are not robot-like enough to remember everything in their head. So you either make a document that holds your passwords, or you have it somehow associated with your browser that the passwords are remembered, and then if somebody gets your device and they can, it's not password protected, they can get all that stuff. So in some sense, they can steal the document of passwords. And of course, my personal favorite, computers left attended while logged in, right? Yeah, you leave your shit open, anybody can walk by and mess with it, right? You can just click on somebody's email box, delete all, and ruin their week. Okay, other examples. This one, thieves went through roofs and walls to steal millions. So, there were a bunch of bank thieves. They said, there's this 3-day holiday coming up, and I bet this bank has a bunch of good shit in their safety deposit boxes. So, they pretended they were a construction crew on top of a building. They figured out where inside the bank the safe deposit box room was. And they said, there's no way we're cutting through that vault door, because the vault door is like basically, a square meter of battleship armor, and they're not cutting through that. So, they waited till a long weekend when nobody was there, and they set up like a big canopy up on top of the building, pretended they were like doing construction and shit, and they drilled down through the roof, all the way down to the safe deposit box room. And they got in there like on a Friday evening when nobody's around, and they just spend the whole weekend leisurely picking through all the deposit boxes, and they got away with millions. Of course, the cops caught up with a couple of them and probably, treated them unpleasantly, and they gave up all their buddies, and now they're doing time. But still, right, the point is this, that bank spent untold millions on that, the whole bank vault security system, and some guys just cut in through the roof. Okay, and if you build a better roof, they're going to come up from the sewers or something else, right? There's always a way in. Okay, now, permissions. Security and access are provided by some kind of application-specific set of permission rules. And the most common one that we've all seen is the user-password pair, right? You give up your username, you enter your password, and then if those two match in their database, then the system thinks, oh, you're you have an account, you have access, blah, 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 here's all your data, right? So, ID and password, we know that. Other stuff, backups. You might have security questions, right? You don't remember your password, but you remember your security question. Other thing, back-end office. So once you've gotten into the system, different accounts will have different permission levels. So I can see all my stuff in the UIC account, right, in my UIC account, but I can't see other people's stuff. I can't see a lot of system-wide data, right? But again, depending on where you are in the organization, somebody has to have access to all that data. Like the HR people, when people get pay raises, that has to get processed through. Somebody has to have access to that, just not me. Anyway, if these access conditions are met, the user gets granted access according to whatever permission level is associated with the account. So somewhere in the back end of the database, You know, there's different categories of employees, and they'll say, ah, you're this category, this is what data you can see. In the case of me, ordinary employee, I only have access to my own data and email, stuff like that. Okay. Now Facebook has different, more, you know, a little bit more complicated, more fine-grained degrees of permission. So a certain amount of this gets delegated to the users, right? Like using apps. So normally on Facebook, you go there, there's a whole bunch of apps. There's probably many thousands of apps these days. And you have the option of whether you want to allow any of those apps to access your data, right? So the basic Facebook app, yeah, they can access your stuff. They have to. They have to be able to send instant messages and accept photos and deliver your feed, stuff like that. But if you want to do some other app, like some random quiz or some little Facebook video game, you have to give it permission to access your data. Okay. Other stuff. Users can designate friends and family as close friends, acquaintances, whatever. You have this kind of customized grouping. So, for example, you go to a big party over the weekend, maybe you want your close friends to see it, but maybe you don't want your parents to see it, things like that. And of course, you can have these user-defined overlapping groups. So these days in Facebook, you can set up custom groups, you know, like people I know from UIC, or people I went to high school with, or friends on Facebook that I don't really like, but I still keep them on as friends, right? You can decide to like block all of those for a while, or just, you know, put them on ice. Anyway, the way filtering works in Facebook, all content has some kind of permission type in its metadata, right? Basically, who is able to see this? When you log into Facebook, it comes up with a whole list of things that you could possibly see, but if it's something that's private, something you don't have permission to see, it just doesn't get served up and part of the feed that gets constructed for you. Okay, so the web page gets automatically constructed or updated to only contain this kind of permitted content. And that's how it works. Every object in Facebook has a permission level. When it's constructing the feed or anything else on Facebook, you only see the things that you're allowed to see. Okay. Now, primary access method on Facebook is email and password, right? Your login, your user ID is your email, your password is your password. So we'll talk about some of this stuff, passwords, and then backup mechanisms. One thing, I guess I'll take this here. When you get asked a security question, right, when it asks you set up a security question, you don't actually have to answer with a legitimate answer, right? So if it asks you, for example, what's your favorite beverage, or what was your favorite subject in high school? That's like a 1 in 12 shot for any random dude to show up and try to guess, right? That's probably a problem. So instead, you know, you might say, what's your favorite subject in high school? And you could say Chicago Bears, right? Or, I don't know, playing poker, I don't know. You could make up something that's not on the list, okay? Most of those security questions, unless it's checking from a list of, you know, check boxes, in general, you can write down whatever you want. What year did you graduate from high school? Pineapple, you could write down. You know, a hacker is probably not going to guess that. Okay. Anyway, so weak and strong passwords. We know what a weak password is, right? In principle, it's a password that's pretty easy to guess. And you could come up with a password that's really stupid easy. For example, a single character password, right? So if you're just restricted to letters, then there's 52 possibilities, right? 26 lowercase, 22 uppercase. Not that hard for a hacker to guess. Okay, so if it's short and just letters, that's easy. If it includes any complete words, right? One of the things that hackers can do is do a dictionary attack. So if your password is just a complete word, even an unusual word, they can run a dictionary attack and try like 100,000 common words all in a dictionary, and maybe you know, a few thousand common names as well. And they got a pretty good chance of getting it. They might not get yours particularly, but if they do a dictionary attack on every account in the world, then yeah, they're going to come up with some of those. And of course, simple sequences, right? Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, something like that. Yeah, those are random things that that hackers guess, like admin, you know. In fact, a lot of password or PIN systems these days specifically say you can't pick 1, 2, 3, 4 because it's so stupid easy, right? Or like 4 zeros, stuff like that. Anyway, Other risk factors, anything that's derived from personal information, right? Your wife's birthday, your kid's shoe size, your dog's name, stuff like that. Any passwords that are used across sites, right? Maybe Facebook's security is pretty good, but you use it on some other site that the security is non-existent, and if you use the same password, then a hacker that gets it from one place can get another. And occasionally, if you look through your spam folder, you might see exactly that. You might see that some hacker has said, we've lifted your password from some site, and we, blah, 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 are going to try to extort some money from you, or we'll destroy everything you have. Okay? I looked through my spam folder a couple of years ago, in fact, found a thing like that. They did have a password from a site I used to use, but I had since changed the password like a couple of years later, and I was like, that's kind of weird. So they got the old password, and they knew it was for me, but, they got it too late to do anything with it, I guess. So, yeah, it can happen. And infrequently or never change, right? If you let your password sit for like 5, 10 years, it's much more likely that somebody's going to be able to lift it, right? On the other hand, the more often you change your passwords, you're going to need some kind of document to store them in, which creates that different point of vulnerability, right? So if you never change your passwords, you just keep them up in your head, yeah, you're trading one kind of vulnerability for another. Okay, strong passwords, though. The ideal for a strong password is a long randomized string of numbers and upper and lowercase letters, maybe even some punctuation and symbols, right? That would be great. Better yet, unrelated to prior passwords. So one of the things that people sometimes do is they'll, have a long string of random stuff, and then they'll rotate one character at the end, which is always a bit of a problem, because if a hacker gets your old password, they can try rotating one character at the end to try to lift it. Best, specific to Facebook, one unique password for Facebook or for any other site. So the advantage of this is it's practically impossible to guess in time to be usable, or before the account gets locked, right? So, most of these sites these days, you have a few chances to access your account before you get locked out of it, right? If you keep trying and trying with bad passwords, eventually you get locked out and you'll have to go through some, either some timeout period, or you'll actually have to call up the site and try to verify who you are, things like that. So, nobody's going to guess that, right? Yeah, there's a non-zero probability that they might, but for all practical purposes, nobody's going to guess that, and because it's such a long shot to guess that, really nobody's going to bother trying. The disadvantage, of course, unless you're robot-like, that kind of password is extremely difficult to remember, right? I mean, you might remember a few of them, but the more passwords like that you have, the more often you change them, it's very difficult to remember. Okay, so we can understand just as an exponential problem, probability of random guess is n to the negative c, where n is the number of options per character, right? So if there's one character, right, c is the number of characters. If I have n possibilities, 52, I'm just using letters, it's a 1 over 52 chance, right? 52 to the negative 1. If it's 2 characters long, it's 1 over 52 squared. If it's 12 characters long, it's 1 over 52 to the 12th. It becomes, vastly harder to guess as the number of characters gets larger and the length of the password string gets longer. Okay. Last thing about passwords, multi-factor authentication. So this is something that's become quite popular in the last 5 years. The idea is you don't want somebody to be able to access your account just because they somehow hacked your password. They also have to have some other mechanism for, proving who they are. For example, at UIC, if you want to access your personal payroll information, having a password is not enough. You also need a PIN number, and you also need some kind of, the other one is network participation. So if you're physically at the UIC campus, that counts as an extra factor. If you're at home, they'll have to send you a text to your phone or email of record. And so then they'll say, okay, and that fairly proves who you are. If you have the password and access to the account and you know the PIN, then yeah, you can go in and look at your stuff, right? Otherwise you can't. So that's how it works for UIC payroll. Anyway, Facebook, right? You have an optional two-factor authentication. A lot of people don't have it active, but if you're somebody who's of some significance and likely to be hacked, a famous person or an important person, you might say, you know what, I want to be a little bit more careful. And you might do that. You might say, well, I need a password and code received through text, so even if somebody does hack your account, they can't just do anything with it. Okay, they have to have that second access mechanism to actually get back in. Okay, so usefulness of this, of course, it blocks the idea that some random person tries to log into your account and they happen to know your email address. They have your email, they have your password, they try to log into your account. They can't because the two-factor authentication is set up. But here's a problem. What if your password is locally stored and that random person steals your phone, right? Because phones get lost and stolen all the time. And you should always, password protect your phone, but not everybody does, okay? Having said that, though, of course, if your phone gets stolen, losing access to your Facebook account might not be your top priority at the moment, right? You might be worried about, say, people accessing your bank account, for example. Also, people are dupable. People get fooled all the time. So, multi-factor authentication, this only works, if everybody's basically on board with stuff, if everybody's following the security procedures. So, you guys may have heard of the hack of the Democratic National Congress, the DNC, in the 2016 election. There's an interesting story there, but basically what happened is there were some Russian bots that were trying to get into the accounts there, and so they did a phishing attack. We'll talk more about that eventually, but that's one link to it. Basically, they fooled some intern who was being kind of careless, and the intern passed up a message to the actual chair of the party, who then said, oh, this is legit, I'm going to go here and I'm going to update my password and other stuff. And he basically gave the keys to the hackers that way because somebody made a mistake and forwarded an email that they shouldn't have. So people fail. Anyway, so encryption. Or let me ask, any questions on any of this stuff? This is the basic stuff, password, security, what it all means. Pretty basic stuff, but any questions? Okay. So, next thing then, encryption. You can see it, I can't. Okay. Strong passwords as plain text in databases. Storing them that way is a big risk because what could happen, some hacker could access the database, download all the accounts and passwords. Some disgruntled employee could copy all of those names and passwords or a large chunk of them to a flash ROM, just walk them out of the building, right? That sort of thing happens. So, if you store them as plain text in databases, it is a big risk. On the other hand, if you store them in some encrypted form, then even if the hackers get in, they don't see the actual password, they just see some jumbled mess of characters that, if somebody enters in one very unusual string through some complicated mathematical process, it converts to this other one. So that's what businesses want to do. Basically, they want to store a scrambled version of the password. So we'll talk about this for a minute. I guess it's worth a story. So eBay got hacked several years ago, and the bad guys got a list of, 50, 100 million accounts and passwords, some giant list, but all the passwords were encrypted, and so it was basically kind of useless. And the last I heard, they were trying to shop that around on the dark web for $50, because if there are any takers on this, they will sell it, but it's kind of useless, right? What do you get for a stack of encrypted passwords? Not much. Okay, so the basic idea is this. You have a password, and on the end, encrypted password. Okay, so I enter in, suppose my password is, Doug Rules, and the encrypted password gets stored as whatever. Okay? There's some mathematical process where this thing goes through here, goes through some complicated mathematical process, and converts to this. So I'll write down here, complicated conversion algorithm. And ideally, the only password that would convert to that is that one in particular, right? So we have, ideally, only one password entry will be converted to the value stored, to the encrypted value stored. Okay? So it might be that's the one and only password that actually converts to that. Yes? Oh, most sites store them encrypted. I mean, any site that's concerned about security. So, you know, your Facebooks, your Googles, whatever. If it's just some, you know, any retail site probably stores them as encrypted. I mean, if it's just some random thing that you show up to, like, I don't know, do stupid quizzes or something, then they might not. I mean, they ought to, but they might not. Okay? Yeah. This is a pretty standard thing because, again, people know that databases get hacked. If somebody steals a bunch of encrypted passwords, it's basically useless. But if they steal a bunch of plain text passwords with the email addresses, then they have the keys to the, you know, the keys to the whole system. So ideally, only one password entry is converted by that process to that endpoint, but it's probably okay if, you know, several convert to that, as long as there are a huge number of possibilities. Okay, so if you're talking that, you know, there are many, many quintillion possible passwords that could be entered, and 5 of them convert to that converted format, you could probably live with that, you know. That's still pretty good odds on your shot. So, but the idea is, anytime you enter a password, right, that password that you entered gets converted through this complicated mathematical process to this, and you check if that input matches that. And the basic idea with this, I'll just mention, this is like, I'll put it in blue, so not really required. Not really required knowledge, but useful. The operating principle for this kind of complicated thing, the operative principle is big prime numbers are easy to multiply, right? Very fast and easy to multiply 2 numbers together, even if they're really big. I mean, for computers, you know, microseconds. However, if you have a product of 2 large primes and you don't know those primes, factoring that product into the 2 primes is an extremely long process, because you basically have to check every possibility, right? And there might be many, 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 because they're big prime numbers, right? So basically, if you have a large number, you have to check every number, like between 1 and the square root of that number, in order to figure out what the possibilities are. Okay, so that's the operative principle. I mean, you would think, well, yeah, I just lift that algorithm, but even then it's not that simple, because it's something that's easy to calculate forward, but not easy to calculate backwards. Okay, so very difficult for the hackers to get this. Okay. So, encryption algorithms, you know, they convert plain text to some kind of scrambled gibberish, and there's some fixed pattern for it. There's some algorithm in place. Okay? It could either be reversible, right? If it's reversible, you have to be able to decrypt it. For example, if I'm sending an encrypted message to someone, in some way, I have to be able to decrypt that for, you know, for the other person to be able to read it. So if I'm sending an email that's encrypted, sure, I send it encrypted over the network so nobody can peek in and look at it. But when you get it, you have to have a decryption mechanism in place. We can talk about hashing as well. We'll bring that up in a little bit. But link there. We'll talk about it if we have time today. Okay. But the big thing to talk about today, asymmetric encryption. Okay. This is like the foundational thing in secure message transmission. So, suppose you have 2 people, Yvonne and Zoe, and they want to communicate via email over a shared network. Okay? Because it's a shared network, people can see what they're sending. So they don't want to just send text out in the clear. Or they'll know that, you know, Zoe has a crush on Freddie or whatever, right? So, how can they encrypt their messages without fear of decryption by any intermediaries or listeners, so that anybody if Zoe sends something to Yvonne, she only wants Yvonne to be able to see it. If Yvonne sends something to Zoe, she only wants Zoe to be able to see it. Okay? Now, scrambling the message works as long as nobody else can obtain the key. So, if Yvonne and Zoe share a common encryption scheme, then it's easy, right? Basically, each endpoint of the communication, they have their code book. Yvonne sends a message to Zoe. Zoe uses this code book, right, or some software version of a code book to translate it. But setting up that code book is a hassle, right? And you might do that for your besties, but you probably wouldn't do it for just, any random site you want to do a secure credit card transaction on, right? Like going to Pizza Hut and buying a pizza. You wouldn't want to go to all that trouble of setting up a code book with Pizza Hut. So, establishing a unique coding scheme for every pair of users would be a great big pain in the ass, right? It would slow everything down. Anytime you wanted to buy something, you would have to do that. Forget about it. So, how can Yvonne and Zoe exchange keys without a listener also obtaining them? How can they exchange keys over the network without a listener getting them? Oh, well, that's an interesting thing. Okay. The way it works, something called two-key encryption. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this in a picture, because pictures are good. So, Yvonne's over here. Zoe is over here. Now, each of these endpoints in the communication, let's do a that'll work. Message sent securely. That's the goal. Okay, so Yvonne has two keys. Public, and we'll call that ypub, and private, we'll call that ypriv. Okay. Zoe, on the other hand, also has two keys. One public, which we'll call zpub, and one private, which we'll call zpriv. Okay, just for short. Now, these keys are just big numbers. These are just big numbers used to encrypt and decrypt the messages. Okay? Now, the other point of these, they are a magic pair of numbers. They are a magical pair of numbers with very special encryption properties, which is any message encrypted by xpub can be decrypted by xpriv, and any message encrypted by xpriv can be decrypted by xpub. Okay? So the two keys, you're holding two keys to the lock. Okay? So Yvonne has a public key and a private key. Anything she encrypts with her public key, she can decrypt with her private key. Likewise, Zoe, anything she encrypts with her public key, she can decrypt with her private key. But it also works for the other way in the pair. If she encrypts it with her private key, she could decrypt it with her own public key. Okay? Now, key consequence, the public keys can be shared with anyone without fear, without security fear, right? We'll call that. As long as the private key remains private. Okay? So I can give my public key out to anybody in the world. As long as I keep my private key, nobody can use it to do anything bad. Because the only thing that that public key can do is decrypt something that I encrypted with the private key. Right? So if I don't encrypt it with that, the public key is just a number and it's not going to do anybody any good. So the way it works, let's move this up a bit. If Yvonne wants to send a secure message to Zoe, she first must get Zoe's public key. Okay? Once Yvonne has ZPub, Zoe's public key, she can encrypt her message with that, and Zoe, and only Zoe, can decrypt it with her own private key, zpriv. Okay? So that's the magical thing about these numbers. If I want to send an encrypted message to Zoe, I ask Zoe nicely, please give me your public key. And Zoe will say, sure, that's harmless, I'll give you my public key. I encrypt the message with Zoe's public key. Nobody else can read it, except Zoe, who has the private key that can decrypt anything coded, encrypted with the other key, with her other key. Does that make sense? I mean, I understand that, the mathematics behind this might be a little, complicated, but we don't need to know that. All we need to know is if Yvonne encrypts a message with her own public key, it can only be decrypted by her private key, right? So if she wants people to send her encrypted messages, she shares her public key out over the entire world. Anybody that wants to send her a secure message encrypts the message with the public key, sends it to Yvonne. Only Yvonne, who has the private key, can read it. Yes? There is a process by which they calculate numbers. Now, not every site uses this, but it is still widely because it takes a little bit of time to set up and generate the large magic number pairs. But one of the ones that uses this is Snapchat, right? Snapchat is one that famously uses this. It's a way of, ensuring that kind of privacy. There's other ways to ensure privacy, but two-factor authentication, once you get the numbers set up, is pretty easy. And what might happen in a lot of cases, a lot of businesses could have, number pairs already pre-existing. So they're not calculating them on the fly, but they know, oh, we're a business, we expect to have, a certain number of new transactions every day. So we have a large pool of these magic number pairs on hand. And then when somebody needs one, we just pull one of them from the stack. Okay. So yeah, it is used out there. Okay. And the way you might, when you get out into the world, you might hear about this as the RSA encryption algorithm. And so that, it's a little bit complicated, but basically the keys are large prime numbers, again with the property that they're quick to multiply together, but very difficult to factorize the product. So if you have one key or you have the other, you multiply it together, it's pretty easy. But if you don't have, if you don't already know what the numbers are, it's very difficult to factor. It takes a long time. Okay, so each user, to ensure this kind of communication remains secure, share the public key, keeps the private key private, and then anything encrypted with your public key, you can decrypt with your own private key. And this is great. So if you have a pool of end users, like 6 billion users on the internet, you only need 12 billion total keys rather than about 6 billion times 6 billion total keys. Okay, if you're setting up unique code pairs between every users, you're going to spend all day generating those numbers. But if you use if you use two-key encryption, then you only need to get, for any user, they have one public and one private key, and they're good to go. Okay. So, example, Yvonne and Zoe exchange public keys while keeping their private keys private. Yvonne encrypts her message with Zoe's public key. Messages encrypted can be sent safely over the open network. When Zoe receives Yvonne's message, she uses her own private key to decrypt it. And if Zoe responds, she can likewise encrypt her message using Yvonne's public key so that only Yvonne's private key will decrypt it. Yes. Sorry, what's that? Yeah, your public key you can give to the entire world. Thus, it's public. And the fact that it's called public or private is just you pick one of them to share and one of them to keep. Okay? It could work, either number could be chosen as public or private, but the public is the one you release because the only thing that decrypts a message that's been encrypted with the public key is your private key. Okay? You keep your private key to yourself. So if somebody wants to send you an encrypted message, they encrypt it with the public key you gave them, and they send it to you, and only your private key will decrypt that message. Yes?
So, like you said, this works for Snapchat as well. So, in a sense, this is like a coding type thing. Like, we don't really pay attention to this stuff.
Yeah, you don't need to dig out and calculate the numbers yourself. Yeah. I mean, way back when I was in grad school, I took a course that was kind of about security. And, we went through this thing to actually generate these numbers. So, yeah. The other thing that might blow a lot of this out of the water, you've heard of quantum computing? You've heard of it? No? Yeah? Well, the idea with quantum computing is basically you get to do the same kind of stuff you do now, but really fast because you get massive parallelism because everything's working in some kind of quantum level stuff. So what might normally, have to happen in a specific place at a specific time, you can do like a whole sequence of related things within that burst of things because they're all happening in parallel somewhere below the level of atoms. It's kind of a crazy thing, but they say it's going to be real. Anyway, the consequence of quantum computing is they'll be able to do a whole lot of computations like this really fast. So algorithms that might have worked in the pre-quantum era that are very difficult problems to solve, once we shift over to quantum computing, which might be, in as little as 10 years, we're going to need more complex algorithms because quantum computing is going to be able to break those really fast. So, all right. We'll do this last one. We'll do hashing, and then we'll call it a day. Okay. So, hashing, I wasn't sure if we get to this or not. Hashing is a mechanism for converting an arbitrarily large pool of things to a fixed number of thing categories. Okay? So, for example, suppose Facebook has an arbitrarily large number of possible passwords, right? Suppose Facebook says there could be 30 possible passwords, okay? And instead of having to store all of those possibilities and allow for all those possibilities, maybe Facebook wants to break it down to some fixed size set of encrypted password outcomes. Okay, so what it would do is basically run things through what's called a hash function. And all a hash function does is it takes this massive list of possible inputs and groups them to this smaller set of inputs, right? And there's some kind of complicated mathematical chopping going on. But an example is, right, suppose Facebook wants to store these passwords as 10-character encrypted forms. Okay? And there are 1e20 possibilities. Okay? So essentially, over here, Facebook would set 1e10 groups, and each group would contain about 1e20 members. Okay, and that's the pairing. So if you're part of a group, in the hash function, you go over to this other side, and you exist in one unique form in the stored table there. So if this is a little confusing, that's okay. I'm not going to ask detailed stuff about hash functions, but the idea is you have an unbounded large set of possibilities on one side, and you want to bring it down to a fixed size group on the other. Basically, you set a bunch of groups, and however things belong to that group, that's how many possibilities you can have on the other side. One last bit of word. One last bit of word. So, one way that this works is something called a hash sum, right? Facebook probably wouldn't do that with passwords. It wants to store the whole complicated password. But what you can do to see if a message has been transmitted correctly, not tampered with in process, you can run the entire message through a hash function, right? So the message could potentially be very, very large, right? There's not really an upper bound to how large a message could be. So what you can do is you can convert that to some fairly small number, like some 4-byte number that has, maybe a couple billion possibilities instead of, unboundedly large. So you distill that message into that one number, and at the end of it, when it's received, you run the contents of the message through that same hash function. If the message hash function that you run matches the hash function attached to the end of the transmission, then you figure, well, it's a 1 in 2 billion shot or 1 in 4 billion shot that, the message got tampered with. Okay? That's the idea. All right. And this is where we'll break. So I'll see you all Wednesday.